years ago today, the very first Five Nights at Freddy's game released. A brilliant little package that has since gone on to completely redefine the state of not just indie horror games, but the horror genre as a whole. The impact this little $5 capitalism simulator had cannot be downplayed. Five Nights at Freddy's might just be the biggest and most impactful horror game ever made. I mean, in only 10 years, we've already seen dozens of games, dozens of books, a massive audience that is still growing to this day, breaching into the AAA market through mainline and VR games, a huge Hollywood film with a sequel well underway, and finally, to top it all off, this crappy Mr. Hippo fridge magnet, which is so funny to me that I bought the entire deluxe edition to Security Breach just to get it. I don't even really like this game that much, but I own the Steelbook. Add it to the collection, I guess. So, how did this happen? And by this, I am referring to FNAF and not my crippling addiction to plastic and tinplate, although that too is something I should probably look into. But alas, that is not the subject of today, but rather, finding out the origins of this funny little Faz Buford and determining once and for all, was the little game that could really worth all the hype? Well, let's find out. Chapter 1, History and Buildup to Release. Meet Scott Cawthon, or rather, re-meet him, because chances are you already know who he is, but I'll explain anyway for the people in the back. Scott has been an indie game developer, 3D modeler, animator, and just about everything else under the sun for quite some time now. In fact, his very first game was made all the way back in 1994 under the title of Doofus, or is it Doofus? Made while Scott was only 16 years old, the game sees this little pink thing doing, actually, you know what? I was gonna write a whole funny spiel about the game, but I think just reading what I assume is the official description from the FNAF wiki will do a better and more entertaining job. Doofus the dinosaur has ruled over Dinostria in great success after having opened the Spazzy Core. The Spazzy Core was a one-way portal into the realm of Lord Grok, who was in charge of making sure universes got their fair share of evil. Doofus created the Spazzy Core so Dinostria could toss it right back into Lord Grok's face. Does Grok have a face? Grok, after having grown tired of this, decided to take matters into his own hands. Grok created Meaton and Prochun out of all his remaining evil for his attack on Dinostria. ... to destroy it. Glad you clarified he wanted to destroy it. I wouldn't have guessed. Anyway, this game is otherwise rather unremarkable, except for the fact that it was developed in a game-making engine known as Click and Play, a little software that would one day be known as ClickTeam Fusion, the engine that Scott still uses to this day for his personal projects, of course excluding the Steelwool games. Despite all of this, however, Scott mostly made a name for himself in the Christian space for his work on various animated projects, perhaps most infamously, The Pilgrim's Progress. A massive hour-long film he made and animated, from what I can tell, entirely by his lonesome.
Excuse me. Wait, can I walk with you?
I cannot wait for you, but I will gladly walk with you if you catch up.
Huh. What?
These films are, to put it nicely, rough, which, I mean, is to be expected given all of the context around them. Despite this, however, it is undoubtedly impressive, and his passion really shines through in these projects, giving them a real certain level of charm you can't really find anywhere else. However, not everyone saw it so kindly, and these films and games of his were all massive commercial and critical failures. Oh well, at least he gave us this thing.
I am the glob glow gab galab, the schwabble double wabble gabble flibber blabber blab. I'm full of schwibble glibber kind. I am the yeast of thoughts and mind.
Something notable about a lot of Scott's early work, including FNAF, is his usage of pre-rendered visuals. You see, while Scott could not, and let's be real here, still cannot model a human being to save his life, he's exceptionally good at modeling pretty much anything else. In fact, I would say 3D modeling is easily one of Scott's strongest skills. Again, as long as it isn't, humans. I mean, you need to look no further than perhaps his most underrated game, The Desolate Hope. A stunningly beautiful game when it comes to the visuals. All of this gives Scott's games a very recognizable style that helps his work stand out. even if it was largely doing anything but that at the time. Hindsight, all that. It wasn't just his skills at modeling, however, but also his commitment and drive. Scott has developed 76 games outside of the FNAF series, and yeah, while a lot of these are just copy and paste slot game machines, but seriously, bud, I think you should seek help for gambling addictions, this number is still nothing to scoff at. I mean, can you say that you'd created 29 games alone in the year of 2014, including such classics as Bible Story Slots, Chubby Hurdles, and of course, Fart Hotel?
Hello, everybody. Steven here, Steven123 Gamer, and
who could forget Fart Hotel? I'm gonna be honest, I'm kind of more curious in how Bible Story Slots went down in the Christian scene. Like, are slots popular there with the Bible? I wouldn't know. For what it's worth, I do actually have some fond memories of a couple of his early iOS games, such as Pimp My Dungeon, Sit and Survive, and RPG Maker, as well as the iconic There Is No Pause button. The latter being the source of Scott's famous profile picture. These games are sadly unavailable now, and have been for quite some time on mobile devices, but all of them were quite fun time wasters back in the day. Scott's early games offer a very interesting piece of insight into not only him as a person, but also many of his drives and what it is he clearly likes to see in a story. Games like Desolate Hope suggest a keen interest in deep sci-fi and strange and sometimes horrifying robotic behemoths, a trend that cropped up in many of his early games and films. He also clearly had a penchant for making child-friendly games. And, also slot machines, those two.
That's why he's the GOAT! The GOAT!
The majority of his early work was, if not Christian, then clearly aimed at a younger demographic, with FNAF being the first horror game that he would ever work on. Unless you count the slot machines, because let me tell you, the amount of debt I sunk into these types of machines before, whoo boy.
I did that! Shut up, you numbskull.
That's several $1,000s I'm never getting back. Yet amongst all these early years games, I would say that by far the most notable is perhaps the very game that single-handedly led to the creation of Five Nights at Freddy's in the first place. This time, moving away from the Christian theming, Scott would end up creating the also infamous Chipper & Sons Lumber Co. This game sees you taking the form of this abomination of God to chop down some trees and build high-density hotels or some stuff. I don't know, I'll be honest, I didn't play the game. And unfortunately, I wasn't alone. Again, this game failed to produce any meaningful splash in the gaming scene that Scott had hoped for, with the most notable thing about the game being a scathing review given by Jim Sterling.
You're taking me to your house. I'm going to fuck your dog.
The game was panned all around by those who did play it, but certainly the most recurring critique came in the form of these various background beavers. Despite the mock attempt at joy plastered on their plastic faces, the cold stare and the unblinking eyes rounded it back to just looking plain creepy. Like, at any moment you might blink and they might move, and then it truly would all be over. It was at this point that Scott began to suffer a crisis of faith. He had long been a hardcore Christian himself, and he had genuinely poured his all into his work, in exchange for seemingly nothing but mocking and ridicule, and so he set out on what he intended to be his final opera. Scott got down to work. If people thought those darned beavers were scary, well, just wait till they got a look at this. If they wanted fear, then fear they would get. You see, Scott did something that some major game studios would shrivel at the idea of. He actually took the criticism and applied it to his next game, intentionally building off of the hurdles of his previous title in an attempt to master the craft of fear that had been created prior, in a way that only an indie game ever truly could. Scott didn't have much to work with, but he took advantage of everything he had to make this exactly what he wanted it to be, taking certain elements from his experiences of making games, a dash of Sit and Survive here, a splash of Chipper & Sons modeling techniques there, and boom! Five Nights at Freddy's was soon to be born. Interestingly, while very little of this game's development was ever properly recorded at the time, a cancelled Kickstarter page reveals that at one point we would be entering Freddy Bear's Pizza, and yeah, that name change was definitely a good thing. We also know from an early gameplay video uploaded on July 13th, about a month before the game would launch, that at one point the game was going to have a live system, and thank God that was cut, because I really don't need that looming over me on Night 7. The original trailer, posted just before this gameplay preview, also provided a look at some unique animations not seen in the game, such as Freddy performing for an audience, and perhaps most interestingly, Bonnie being the one to charge down the hallway, this time stopping at the camera to take off his mask and stare into your soul. How quaint. This was apparently inspired by a nightmare Scott had had while working on the game. However, the character who would end up running ended up becoming Foxy later, as Scott thought it would make more sense for a fox character to charge down the hallway rather than a bunny. Five Nights at Freddy's would be officially launched on August 8th via Desura, never heard of that, and August 18th for its wider Steam release, and while the game would start out slow in terms of growth, one major event would change the trajectory of this franchise forever.
Hello everybody, my name is Markiplier and welcome to Five Nights at Freddy's, an indie horror game that you guys...
Hello everybody, my name is Markiplier. What do you think of my impression? On August 12th, 6 days before the launch of the Steam page, internet Let's Player Markiplier would release a video entitled, "Warning! Scariest game in years! Five Nights at Freddy's Part 1. This is, as you might expect, a fairly typical Let's Play of a horror game from today's time. Mark gives it all the adequate reactions to being jump scared.
Ah, fuck! No! Fucking fuck! I tried to push it! Oh my god!
But for some reason, this game really stuck with not just him, but the audience who watched it. They quickly flocked to the game and told their friends about it, and soon it was everywhere. This game had absolutely blown up, so then enough beating around the proverbial bush. Let's jump into it, shall we? What is it exactly that made Five Nights at Freddy's such a blowout success? Chapter 2, the graphics and atmosphere. So, first off, I want to cover perhaps my favorite thing about this game, and that's the vibe, the gist, the mood, the ambiance. This game absolutely excels at making you forget about everything else around you when you're playing alone in the dark at night. The distant creaking of the pizzeria, the off-putting music boxes, and the clattering of pots and pans in the kitchen. The game may not open with some massive budgetary sinkhole of a whole tutorial area and a big animated cutscene and cinematic sound or whatever. Instead, it revels in its simplicity to provide a chilling experience that even today, with all of the Five Nights at Freddy's clones, is still largely unmatched. Scott's signature style blends perfectly into this game and helps to turn it from some flat and forgettable experience into a gripping fight for survival. The sound design, which ranges from wholly original sound effects composed for the game to various stock sounds that Scott found around, all serve the purpose of immersing you in this grim and twisted pizzeria. And the ever-present ambiance droning in the background makes sure that you never forget that. This is where the real horror lies, in the suspense, something brilliantly crafted by the careful combination of sounds and sights. Like many of Scott's previous work, the game has a distinct style to it, again separating itself from the myriad of clones and fan projects as the real deal. Despite this, however, it still manages to drastically differentiate itself from Scott's other works in all the right ways, turning those childhood memories into a twisted grin of nostalgic dread. Clearly inspired by the likes of Chuck E. Cheese's, the old and worn-down location is dripping with character. Despite us only ever seeing specific shots of the pizzeria through the cameras, we can really get a feel for it. This feels like a real lived-in place, the grungy tiles and uncleaned walls to the dusty desk and cobwebbed corners. This dingy little office is our one light in the darkness, quite literally, sometimes. With nowhere left to run, we really do feel the dread that all we can do is lock ourselves away and pray for the best, while expecting the worst. The sounds of the animatronics thumping their way around outside has always been the sticking point for me. While some of the future games would use the sound effects fairly interchangeably, these first few entries really make the most out of it as described earlier, but the character sounds are particularly memorable. One that always comes to mind is the wheezing groan that Bonnie makes right before he kills you, a signifier that death is only seconds away, and yet every time I feel it, it feels like an eternity of dread leading to the climactic crescendo. The jump scare sound is perhaps the most iconic sound effect to each FNAF game's credit. People have gone so far as to make rankings and tier lists of the various game's sound effects, and what a way to start. Sampling a clip from Inseminoid, an 80s horror flick where a woman gives birth to an alien, the sound of distress and pain serves itself perfectly to being the last sound you ever hear before the harsh static cuts off everything else, simulating the harsh and abrupt ending to your life in tandem with the flashy animation. And that's another thing of note, is how this game uses its animations. Scott, having worked on plenty of animations in his time, is no stranger to the craft, and yet the game seems to almost be holding itself back from using them. We never see the animatronics physically moving on cameras, save for one exception, which we'll get to, so when we are met by the highly animated movements present in each jump scare, it furthers the uncanny nature the game offers and shocks us to our cores. On a first playthrough, you won't have expected anything quite as animated, especially up until this point. But this animation jumps out at you, literally, and pulls you into the immersion further, whereas in the back of your mind you had built up safety walls, reminding yourself that it's only a game. These animations make you forget that, if even only for a few seconds, because of how jarringly realistic they seem in comparison to the choppy fan and cobwebs you have otherwise been subjected to. This doubled even further in Foxy's iconic running animation. Seen on the left hull as he charges towards your door, obviously inspired by the Bonnie run from the first trailer. This moment uses the exact same things that made the early jump scares so effective, which is the movement in places you had otherwise thought to be safe from them. This time, the cameras. While many have derided Foxy's actual jump scare as being too plain, this is more than made up for by the sprint that he will partake in if you go too long without checking your cameras. A mistake most players are sure to do their very best to avoid after the first time experiencing this. I think it's because of how jarringly out of place these jump scares are at first that made them such a staple of the series. Many other games have tried and failed to create jump scares even half as iconic as the ones in the FNAF franchise, and I think they will continue to do so. For as flashy and high budget as Poppy Playtime, Bendy and the Ink Machine, and hell, even Security Breach might be, it is entirely down to this otherwise crude presentation that lulls us into the terror that these jump scares can provide. And it's so expertly crafted that I can't even be mad. That's right, Chica. You can jump scare me any day. Chapter 3, the gameplay. Close to 20 minutes in and we're only just talking about the gameplay? That's how you know it's a game worth experiencing. Five Nights at Freddy's is, on paper, an incredibly simple game, and it's exactly because of this that it has quickly become one of the most popular horror games of all time. Anyone can pick this up and play it, in much the same way anyone can pick up a Mario or Zelda game and have a fun time. Ironically, in all of its clear differences, I find that the gameplay here reminds me more of the philosophy you might find in a Nintendo game versus most other publishers. Flashiness is clearly not the intention, nor has it ever been. Instead, gameplay trumps all, and the value of a first and foremost fun and challenging experience is at the core of this game. All too often nowadays, we find mascot horror games being nothing more than a simple walking simulator with the odd jump scare or laughably simple puzzle to tide you along between set pieces. I'd argue FNAF is even guilty of this to an extent in later entries. And while that kind of game can be innovated upon with more pizzazz to actually make it something worthwhile, and I certainly don't want to downplay that, this is very much so an example of less being more. All of the mechanics work together in tandem with each other to make for a more challenging and fun experience, and it's clear that a lot of thought went into them as proven by the fact that there are scrap mechanics, such as the lie system. Scott is first and foremost a game developer. He's had over a decade of experience by this point, so handcrafting a unique gameplay experience was no doubt the first thought in his mind when he sat down to work on his next project. I've already briefly discussed how this game mimics some gameplay elements of previous Cawthon titles, most notably Sit and Survive. In Sit and Survive, sit and survive. As a camper sits alone in the forest, you provide him with various tools to protect him from insects or the weather or what have you. While this game's form of protection are much more broad than in FNAF's, often leaning more into fun and quirky stylism over more realistic horrors presented in Freddys, they all serve the core function of protecting your character from the bad guys. Well, shift your perspective and take away almost all forms of protection beyond the doors and boom, you've got yourself the formula for FNAF. In fact, I'd argue the lack of options in protecting yourself goes a long way. While Sit and Survive almost felt more like a tycoon game, this one is much more focused on the tension of barely scraping by. These metal doors will save you, but at the cost of an ever-depleting battery, and you will also have no clue as to when to use them without first using your cameras or the lights right outside your doors, both of which are essential to surviving, but also sap your power. Because of this power mechanic, you are incentivized to find any moment you can to just sit alone in the office. No clue as to where the animatronics might be, but conserving power is a necessity. As such, the animatronics have time to spread out, get closer, and if you wait too long, then Foxy might get fed up and just jump scare you anyway. This tension of having to guesstimate how long you have left before you should check your cams is the crucial part to the fear factor, especially for new players who don't know the AI of the robots and skill sets inside and out. Finally, what adds to the fear factor is an element of randomness. Characters all take familiar paths throughout the game, but the time intervals at which they move are randomized on a scale. Add in the ever so elusive fifth secret character, Golden Freddy, and the game always keeps you on your toes. To survive, you will have to familiarize yourself with each of the characters over the nights. The most common will be Bonnie and Chica. Bonnie will traverse down the left side of the pizzeria towards your left door, and Chica to your right. Both are fairly simple to find in their respective cameras, as they never make any attempt to hide, with exception of the kitchen camera, which doesn't work, which Chica passes through routinely. Eventually, however, you will note a tracker in there via the sound cues that play whenever Chica passes through the kitchen. That of pots and pans clattering. Next is Foxy. He sits behind the curtain in Pirate's Cove and only becomes active on the second night onward. Throughout the night, he has a chance of peeking further and further out of his curtain, until eventually he gets out and makes a mad dash down the right hall for you. By this point, you have only a couple seconds to flip down the camera and close the door. However, this can be stalled a bit by only seeing he has gone missing and not checking the hall cam right away, instead opting to close the door immediately. Foxy, however, can be delayed further by just using the cameras. As long as you are in the cameras, he will always fail his movement check, giving you more time before you need to take up your defenses. Finally, the OG, Freddy Fazbear, the main star of the game, only becomes active in the later half of the game. And this is by far the deadliest. Like Chica and Bonnie, he will progress through the facility like normal towards your office, specifically your right door. However, unlike them, if he reaches your door and it is closed, he will simply stay there. He does not reset back to a previous position like Bonnie or Chica or Foxy do. Instead, he will wait there until your power drains or your night ends. As such, it is crucial to stall Freddy before he reaches you, as once he moves forward, there is no sending him back. So, how does this work? Well, Freddy can be stalled in one way, by keeping the cameras open, specifically on the camera that Freddy is on. Unlike Foxy, you have to be looking directly at Freddy for his movement checks to fail, meaning he will often slip away when you pull down the camera to close the door or to check on Foxy. Every time Freddy moves, he makes a laugh, which can be heard from the office, so you will at least always know when he moves, but even then, finding where he has moved to can be tricky for new players. While he follows a set path similar to Chica, he is much harder to spot in the cameras, and he is almost always obscured in darkness, only visible by his bright white eyes lighting up the darkness and the occasional view of his silhouette. As such, tracking him can often become a game of hide and seek, but with deadly game-ending consequences should you fail. Finally is Golden Freddy, who is less of an actual obstacle and more of a general Easter egg, a hidden secret character that appears very rarely, but he can end your game, quite literally, so he is still someone you should watch out for. Sometimes, at random when you flip down your camera, he might be found sitting in your office ahead of you. If you stare at him for too long, he kills you with a highly unique jump scare and your game will crash. Countering him is simple enough though, just flip up your camera and flip it back down. Just hope that Bonnie or Chica aren't in the door when you have to do this, or it's lights out. With all of the characters and mechanics in mind, the gameplay takes place across 5 main nights, each night progressing the difficulty by upping the character levels, with a higher level leaving a higher likelihood that they will move when their movement check comes along. Something particularly deadly with Freddy. However, upon completing this, a bonus 6th night is unlocked, as well as a 7th custom night, where you can customize the enemy AI yourself. This, of course, gave birth to the infamous 420 mode. Setting each of the 4 characters to their highest AI level at 20 produces the hardest challenge in the game. In fact, this challenge is so hard that Scott used to think it was flat out impossible. As such, there was no reward for beating this challenge at first in the game. However, after it was finally proven to be possible, Scott ended up adding in another star that can appear on the profile screen when you do so, rounding out the star count to 3. One for completing the first 5 nights, another for night 6, and a final star for 420 mode. So, in retrospective gameplay, no, it isn't anything groundbreaking. But it is unique. It's short and simple, and it does everything it needs to do. Game mechanics are taught naturally through the use of phone guy, or left to be intuited by the player throughout the experience. The game's difficulty curve feels fair, and the mechanics all work in tandem with each other to form an overall fun package. All in all, the game is fun. And if it isn't fun, then why bother? God, I miss Reggie being in Nintendo Directs. Chapter 4, Story and Secrets. FNAF as a franchise is known for many things. Perhaps most infamously, its convoluted and out-of-control story. one that has spanned games, books, films, and more. And the web of what's canon and what isn't, what leads to where and who did what is, well, complicated. But we're not discussing all of that. We're just here to briefly talk about the story elements provided in this game. So, what have we got? Well, for main campaign present in the game, at first glance, there isn't much. We open the first night with a shot of a newspaper, implying we, as the protagonist, are simply looking for a gig, and the night guard position is open, so we take it, unaware of the horrors that it will bring. After surviving 5 grueling days, plus a bonus extra 2 days, we are fired because of tampering with the animatronics, odor, and general unprofessionalism.
Hunka hunka!
And boom bada bing. That's all there is, right? Well, of course not. For starters, one big peek into the lore we have is the phone guy. Each night at the beginning, we receive a phone call from some guy, hence the fanbase lovingly dubbing him the phone guy. He delivers some dialogue that, from a gameplay perspective, serves to hint at various gameplay features and explain the general setup, as well as passing the time in the early hours of Night 1, when nothing is happening. But he also provides some genuine snippets of lore, sprinkled throughout. For starters, we learn these are all presumably pre-recorded messages, as he explains he has not only worked in the same office before us, but is actively finishing up his first week now. He then explains how the animatronic characters do get a bit quirky at night.
You need to hang up that computer call. Come over here and kiss me on my hot mouth. I'm feeling romantic.
Telling us he has dealt with the moving animatronics. But presumably it started much tamer for him before ramping up for us, so this isn't a new phenomenon at least. Apparently, the characters are left in a free roaming mode at night, so their joints don't lock up, which, sure bud. We also learn that they used to be allowed to wander around during the day, but after an event ominously referred to as the Bite of 87, that ability was taken away. We also learn that the bite victim did survive, just without their frontal lobe intact. Ouch.
No, but the girls say I'm the bomb.
Finally, from the Night 1 call, we learn that the animatronics probably won't recognize us as human if they see us after hours, but rather an endoskeleton without a costume. And as such, they will forcefully try to shove us into a costume, which will result in the death scene in the game over screen. After telling us this, he wishes us luck, and it's off to the races for Night 1. Night 2's call sees the return of the phone guy, who warns us that the animatronics do get more aggressive as the week progresses. He also tells us we should probably be checking the cams even as he's talking. This is also where we learn that while Freddy doesn't come off stage very often, he has been known to do so in the dark, hinting at what happens when you run out of power, assuming you didn't during Night 1. He also warns us of a blind spot in the cameras right outside of our doors, which is of course covered by the lights, although this is likely something you would have figured out by Night 1. Finally, he warns us of Foxy and how he gets agitated if the cameras remain off, hinting to us he will become active soon. Although it is entirely possible for him to become active in Night 1, as I actually managed to do in my gameplay. Hi, Foxy. Night 3 opens with him congratulating us on making it this far, which is apparently uncommon. Here we don't get any lore, although he does suggest that we try playing dead if we get caught, only to realize they then just shove an endoskeleton up our... Well, point is that doesn't save you. Night 4 opens with the audible sounds of the animatronics outside the door. Phone Guy tells us this might be his last night, and tells us to check the back rooms if we ever get a chance. And as he starts to tell us something else, we hear that moaning that plays when they get into our room, and Golden Freddy's jump scare end the call. So that's it for phone calls, right? Well, there is one more on Night 5, but well, just listen to it yourself. Interestingly though, something can be taken from this. Reversing the audio and blotting out the screams and garbledness, we can make out an excerpt from a book named Autobiography of a Yogi. I had somehow been aware this has ever been deciphered, so it's cool to hear this for the first time. Filling in the blank spaces from the rest of the prose, we get,
Sir, it is lamentable that mass agricultural development is not speeded by fuller use of your marvelous mechanisms. Would it not be easily possible to employ some of them in quick laboratory experiments to indicate the influence of various types of fertilizers on plant growth? You are right. Countless uses of Bo's instruments will be made by future generations. The scientist seldom knows contemporaneous reward. It is enough to possess the joy of creative service.
So, without having read the book myself, I cannot say with 100% certainty as to why this book would have been used, but from what I can find online, it seems that this book does feature themes and discussions on a living metal, something that would become ominously familiar to a later plot point, but as of this game, it might just be referring to the animatronics directly in a sort of metaphorical sense, and whatever it is that might be, in a sense, controlling them. The book has also been described as spiritual in nature, which would match with Scott's large catalog of games based upon his faith in religion, as well as the theme of spirits possessing the animatronics, which is heavily implied by later pieces of evidence in this lore. Upon completing the 5th night, we receive a check worth 120 buckaroos, and it tells us our character's name, Mike Schmidt. Upon completing night 6, we receive compensation for our overtime in the form of an extra 50 cents. Wow! That's better overtime pay than I make. I'm not joking. Finally, the custom night delivers us the pink slip mentioned earlier, where we are fired for tampering and odor. So, what else? Well, perhaps the biggest avenue of receiving lore is through the secret screens. Different alternate screens to existing camera angles that offer some valuable information, or sometimes they're just plain creepy. That works too. But there are a few of these rare screens I take particular interest in. For one, the posters that can appear in the right hall, which depict a crudely drawn crying child. Ominous on its own, but wait, there's more. This poster here almost appears to be Freddy trying to rip his own head off, almost as if he's trying to get something out from inside of himself. And sometimes this poster just shows Golden Freddy. It's also possible, seemingly at random, you'll see visual hallucinations with the words, "It's me," flashing on screen. This phrase can even be seen plastered on Foxy's sign after he has run out in some rare instances, or plastered on the walls of the right hallway. Perhaps most illuminating, however, are the 4 separate newspaper clippings that can appear at random in the back of the right hall, over top of the posters. From these, we learn that on June 26th, someone who was later taken into custody was presumed to have dressed as a company mascot and lured 2 kids into the back room of Freddy Fazbear's. Apparently, while the video surveillance was able to catch the baddie, the 2 kids were never found. Another clipping clarifies that upwards of 5 children had gone missing, and elaborates how none of the bodies have ever been found. The third clip explains a pizzeria had been threatened with a shutdown over sanitation issues, with it reporting one woman claimed to have seen human blood dripping from the animatronics. Finally, the 4th clipping reveals that the pizzeria is shutting down by the end of the year. Even years after the missing children incident, they cannot find any buyers and are forced to close their doors. So, what does this tell us? Well, it doesn't take a genius to figure out exactly where those missing children's bodies likely went. Think about it. Blood dripping from the suits, and they want to stuff anyone they find into a suit, even if it kills them? No doubt the killer lured them into the back room with the mascot costume and killed them. He then stuffed their bodies where no one would ever look. Apparently, inside the animatronics.
Party! Yo!
I guess Fazbear Inc. doesn't do checkups on their endoskeletons, but when you've got little ghost kids possessing them, I guess you don't really need to worry about that. So, in summary, we have just learned of what is known as the missing children incident, as well as a separate incident involving a bite sometime around 1987. We know the killer was apparently convicted, but the bodies were never found, and are now presumably trapped inside the animatronic suits, their souls unable to move on. Finally, I find it incredibly important to point out perhaps the most important hidden Easter egg in the history of a franchise. You can honk Freddy's nose by clicking on the poster in your office. Neat. Also, as a side note, I was going to include a section where I take community thoughts and just comments from people who have watched my channel before or wanted to talk about the first FNAF and include them here and kind of read them out. You know, whether they liked the game, didn't like the game, or really any general thoughts. I ended up only getting a single response, which I will be reading out, but I'll probably save making a whole section for it in the future should I get more momentum on that. But if you'd like to be featured in the next video, which I'm hoping will be a FNAF 2 one around the time that comes out, I mean, I'll probably do stuff in between, but you know, the next big one like this, go ahead and leave a comment down below with your thoughts on FNAF 2. I might just feature it in the next video. Anyway, while lots of people did see it and interact with the poll, for which you can see the results, I did only get one response, so I'll go ahead and read that out now. Coming here from Calon Rivera, if I'm saying that correctly, and if I'm not, I do apologize. The first game is good, but I think that later games are better, like FNAF 2. But the best part about the first game is the mystery, which I think gets kind of spoiled by some later things. I prefer not knowing Afton's motivations, or even that he was named Afton, because it made the missing children's incident scarier. And yeah, I kind of see where you're coming from. In a way, learning everything there is to know about the missing children incident and Afton and why he did it, how he did it, what all the kids' names were, kind of, in the order, hell, we even kind of know the order he killed them. Yeah, we definitely do know perhaps more than we needed to about this incident, to a point where it's not really a big mystery at all anymore. And it kind of comes down to wondering, how the fuck did the authorities not figure this out? I mean, again, do they not, does Fazbear Animatronics just not check their, animatronics? But I would argue a lot of these come down more to flaws in later games, just over-explaining some aspects while under-explaining others, which, believe me, we'll get to. But at the same time, for a franchise as long-running as this, I guess we shouldn't have expected the mystery introduced in the first game to really have lasted all that long, because pretty much by the instance of the fourth game, we know everything there is to know. So, with all that said, though, I do see where you're coming from, and I do see how there's a certain tinge of mystery here in the first game that isn't really there in future games, which does make this one stand out a bit more. Chapter 5, Conclusion. So, it's been 10 years. For this last section, I sort of want to just reflect on that for a minute. I mean, 10 years? How has it already been that long? It feels like only a short while ago I first learned about the series. That was sometime after the second game had just released in late 2014, so I guess I've still got a few months before my personal connection to the series reaches that mark, but all the same, I mean, that is still a long time. This little indie game has gone on to do so much since. I'd argue it's even surpassed the likes of Minecraft in terms of pure relevancy. Okay, hi Connor is sending me 1,000 invites to Team Fortress 2. That's cool. I'd argue it's even surpassed the likes of Minecraft in terms of pure relevancy. And while it certainly had its dips in popularity, it never entered a proper state of complete silence, and at this point, I don't think it will anytime soon. The franchise is in perhaps the best place it's ever been, with the raging success of the film, the multiple upcoming games, and as of you watching this, we should have some idea of what Steel Wool is working on. I'm writing this back in June, so I don't know what the August 4th announcement will be, but I hope it's something exciting. Personally, I'm kind of hoping for a new game in the style of Security Breach. Just maybe make this one actually complete on launch, maybe? Cool, thanks. But I do think that free roaming style can really do wonders if done correctly. Come on, baby, give me a theme park setting, you know you want to. But that's enough of me huffing copium about what I want to see for the future FNAF game. If you want to know about my thoughts on that, I got a video for that, so maybe check that out later. But that aside, this is a series that has been pretty close to my heart for darn close to half my life at this point. And trust me, that is boggling to say. So to take a moment to look back has been very rewarding. I'm excited for the future. I'm nostalgic for the past. So I guess I just want to really delve into that. My hope is to do a big retrospective like this for each game in the series on its respective 10th anniversary. So probably I'll see you again in November for a big bad look at the good old 2. That one's gonna be fun. But as far as this first game is concerned, what else is there to be said? But the fun's only just begun. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this, then be sure to subscribe. I've got plenty more videos in the pipeline, and I'm excited to share them all with you. So until then, ciao!